The wind howled across the frozen Montana plains like a banshee's wail, driving snow so thick Sarah could barely see her own hands. In the abandoned barn where she'd taken shelter, 3 newborn foals pressed against their mother, their tiny bodies shaking from cold that could kill them within hours. Sarah's fingers were already turning blue, but she couldn't leave them, not after what she'd sacrificed, to save these horses from the slaughterhouse. Then she heard it, the thunderous sound of hoofbeats cutting through the storm. A massive silhouette filled the barn doorway. 6'6" of pure muscle wrapped in a black duster, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Jake Morrison hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 years, not since the fire that took everything from him. But something about this woman's fierce determination to protect these helpless creatures awakened something he thought had died with his family. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing between them. Could a man running from his demons really be the salvation this woman and her foals desperately needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah scrambled backward against the rotting barn wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The stranger's horse, a massive black stallion that looked more like a creature from nightmares than flesh and blood, snorted and stamped, its breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "Don't hurt them." Jake stood motionless in the doorway, snow swirling around his imposing frame. The mare and her foals huddled together, their dark eyes reflecting his presence with primal fear. He'd tracked their hoofprints for the last 2 miles, following a trail that spoke of desperation and exhaustion. What he hadn't expected was to find a woman who looked like she'd rather die than abandon these animals. Her auburn hair had escaped its braid, whipping around a face that was pale with cold but fierce with determination. Her clothes, a thin jacket and jeans that offered little protection against Montana's brutal winter, told him she wasn't prepared for this storm. Nobody was prepared for a blizzard this savage in October. "You're dying," he said finally, his voice rusty from disuse. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, making her flinch. "I won't leave them." Her chin lifted with stubborn pride that reminded him of someone else, someone he'd lost to flames and his own failures. "They're just babies." Jake's jaw tightened. He could see the mare was spent, probably hadn't eaten in days. The foals couldn't be more than a week old, their legs still unsteady, their coats not yet thick enough for this weather. They wouldn't survive another hour without heat. "Neither will you," he said, stepping into the barn. His spurs jingled with each deliberate movement. Temperatures dropping fast. This storm's going to last through the night. Sarah pressed herself further against the wall, but her eyes never left his face. Even in the dim light filtering through the barn's broken boards, she could see the hard lines etched around his eyes, the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. This was a man who'd seen violence, maybe dealt it too. "I have blankets," she said, though they both knew the threadbare horse blankets piled in the corner wouldn't be enough. Jake's gaze swept the barn, taking inventory with the precision of someone accustomed to life-or-death decisions in wind and snow. No hay, no grain, nothing to burn for warmth. He'd found tracks of at least 6 horses heading into this valley 3 days ago. Now there was only the mare and her foals. "Where are the others?" he asked. "Sarah's. Where are the others?" he asked. Sarah's face crumpled for just a moment before she regained control. "Taken. The men who owned the ranch. They came for them yesterday morning. I managed to hide in the woods with Luna and her babies, but..." She swallowed hard. "The others are probably already dead." "My ranch is 5 miles north," he said abruptly. "Heated barn, hay, grain." Hope flickered in Sarah's green eyes before suspicion replaced it. "Why would you help us?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He couldn't explain that something about her reminded him of his wife's fierce love for their animals, or that the foal's helplessness triggered protective instincts he'd thought buried forever. Instead, he stepped toward his horse, pulling rope from his saddlebags. "Because they'll die if I..." Before suspicion replaced it. "Why would you help us?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He couldn't explain that something about her reminded him of his wife's fierce love for their animals, or that the foal's helplessness triggered protective instincts he'd thought buried forever. Instead, he stepped toward his horse, pulling rope from his saddlebags. "Because they'll die if I don't." The wind had teeth, and they bit deep into Clara's bones as she stumbled through the whiteout, her boots sinking into snow that grew deeper with each desperate step. Behind her, the makeshift shelter she'd cobbled together from fallen branches and her torn coat wouldn't last another hour in this storm. The three foals huddled inside were already showing signs of hypothermia, their breathing shallow, their movements sluggish. She'd been a fool to think she could make it to the neighboring ranch before the weather turned. Now, with visibility down to mere feet and the temperature plummeting, Clara faced the harsh reality that she might have led them all to their deaths. The foals, orphaned when their mother died giving birth just 2 days ago, were her responsibility, her last hope of salvaging something from the wreckage of her life. Through the howling wind, she caught sight of something that made her heart stutter. Smoke, a thin grey line barely visible against the white chaos, but unmistakably real. Someone was out here, someone with fire and shelter. Clara turned back toward her failing refuge, her mind racing. She couldn't move the foals in this weather, but she couldn't leave them either. "Ma'am." His voice cut through the wind, low and steady. "Saw your fire from my cabin. This storm's going to get worse before it's done." Clara's relief nearly buckled her knees. "I have 3 foals," she called back, gesturing toward the shelter. "They're dying. I can't—" He was already moving past her, dropping to one knee beside the crude lean-to. His hands, she noticed, were gentle as he examined the animals, efficient and knowing. 2 days old, maybe 3, he said without looking up. "Premature? Their mother had complications. I've been trying to keep them warm, but—" "You did good." He stood, his grey eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was something in that gaze that made her breath catch, not just the kindness she desperately needed, but shadows too. Old pain, carefully guarded. "Name's Caleb Morrison. Got a place about a 1/4 mile east. Room for you and your horses." The way he said it, simple and matter-of-fact, made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched as he shrugged out of his coat and began wrapping the weakest foal, a little bay filly whose breathing had grown alarmingly shallow. "Can you handle one?" he asked, already lifting the filly with surprising tenderness. Clara gathered the second foal, a sturdy colt who protested weakly at being moved. The third, another filly, went into Caleb's other arm with practiced ease, as if he'd done this before, which, she supposed, he probably had. This was Montana ranch country after all. The trek to his cabin tested every muscle Clara had left. The wind tried to tear them off course, and the snow seemed determined to swallow them whole, but Caleb never faltered. He moved like a man who knew exactly where he was going, even when the world disappeared into white noise around them. When the cabin finally materialized through the storm, Clara could have wept with relief. It was small but solid, built from local timber and river stone, with smoke rising steadily from a stone chimney. Light glowed warm and golden in the windows, promising everything she'd been praying for: heat, safety, hope. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that threw heat into every corner. Caleb had already set up a makeshift stall near the hearth, lined with what looked like his own blankets. He settled the foals with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown outside, then moved to stoke the fire higher. "There's coffee on the stove," he said without turning around. "Help yourself. Going to be a long night." Clara's hands shook as she poured the coffee, whether from cold or delayed shock she couldn't say. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and leather, and something indefinably masculine that wasn't unpleasant. Personal things were sparse, a few books on a shelf, a rifle mounted above the fireplace, but little else that spoke of the man who lived here. "I can't pay you," she said finally, the words scraping her throat raw. "I don't have anything left." Caleb looked up from where he knelt beside the foals, his expression unreadable. Didn't ask for payment. But Clara had lived long enough to know that everything came with a price, especially salvation. She just hoped that when the storm passed and the bill came due, she'd be strong enough to pay it, making her throat raw. "I don't have anything left." Caleb looked up from where he knelt beside the foals, his expression unreadable. Didn't ask for payment. But Clara had lived long enough to know that everything came with a price, especially salvation. She just hoped that when the storm passed and the bill came due, she'd be strong enough to pay it. The wind had teeth, and it was hungry. Elena pressed herself against the barn wall, feeling the old wood groan under the storm's assault. Through the gaps between the boards, snow drove sideways like frozen bullets, and she could barely make out the dark shape of the stranger working in the corral beyond. He moved with purpose, despite the blizzard's fury, his broad shoulders cutting through the wind as he secured the last of the loose boards that had been threatening to tear free. She'd watched him work for the past hour, marveling at how he seemed unaffected by conditions that would have sent most men running for shelter. The three foals huddled closer to their mother, Stella, who nickered softly in the dim light filtering through the barn's single window. Elena checked them again, running her hands along their small bodies, feeling for any sign of distress. They were weak but alive, for now. Without proper shelter and feed, they wouldn't last another night in this cold. The barn door crashed open, bringing with it a swirl of snow and the stranger. He shook himself like a wolf, ice crystals falling from his dark coat as he pushed the door shut against the wind's protest. In the sudden quiet that followed, Elena could hear her own breathing, quick and shallow. "That won't hold much longer," he said, nodding toward the wall where she'd been standing. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was set in a hard line. "This whole place is ready to come down." "It's held for 15 years, Elena said, though even as she spoke, another section of wall creaked ominously. "Not through a storm like this." He moved past her to examine Stella and the foals, his hands gentle as he checked them over. "When did they drop?" 2 days ago, during the first part of the storm. She watched his face for any reaction, but his expression remained unreadable. "I couldn't get them to town. The roads were already impassable." He nodded, still focused on the horses. One of the foals, a small bay filly, struggled to stand. The stranger steadied her with one large hand, murmuring something too low for Elena to hear. The filly settled, leaning against his palm. "You got a name?" Elena asked suddenly. She'd been calling him stranger in her mind for hours now, but something about watching him with her horses made her want to know more. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, without looking at her, he said, "Colt." "Elena." She waited for him to offer more, a last name, maybe where he'd come from or where he was headed, but he remained focused on the horses. "We need to move them," Colt said, straightening up. "This barn won't survive the night, and they won't survive without shelter." "Move them where? There's nowhere to go. The house is too small, and even if we could get them there, my place." The words hung in the air between them. Elena stared at him, trying to read something in his expression, but it was like looking at granite. "Your place?" "About 2 miles north. Cabins solid, barns built to last, storm cellar if things get worse." He was already moving, gathering the lead ropes she'd hung on a peg near the door. "But we need to go now, before this gets any worse." Elena's mind raced. 2 miles in this storm, with 3 newborn foals and their exhausted mother. It seemed impossible, but as if to emphasize his point, a section of the barn's roof lifted slightly, held down only by the accumulated weight of snow. "They can't walk that far," she said. "Got a sledge? We'll bundle the foals, lead the mare." He was already moving toward the back of the barn, where her father's old work sledge sat under a tarp. "You coming or not?" It wasn't really a question. Elena could hear it in his voice, the certainty that this was their only option. She thought of her father, of how he'd taught her to read storms, to know when to fight and when to yield. "What's this going to cost me?" she asked quietly. Colt paused in his preparations, and for a moment something flickered across his features. When he looked at her, there was something in his dark eyes she couldn't identify. "We'll figure that out later." The wind howled again, and this time Elena heard something new in its voice, a promise of worse to come. She looked at the foals, so small and vulnerable, then back at the man who'd appeared out of the storm like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was making. "All right," she said, moving to help him with the sledge. "But if you're planning to rob me blind, you should know there's nothing left to take." Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his lips. "Lady, if that were true, you wouldn't still be here." The storm had been raging for 3 days when Elena finally admitted she was going to die out here. She pressed her back against the rough wooden walls of the abandoned lined shack, pulling her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders. The wind howled through gaps in the chinked logs, carrying snow that stung like glass shards. In the corner, the 3 foals huddled together for warmth, their mothers lost to the blizzard that had caught them crossing the high pasture. Elena had found the foals half frozen, their legs trembling as they called for mares who would never answer. Something in their desperate whinnying had cut straight through to her heart, perhaps because she recognized the sound of abandonment. Now they were all trapped together, slowly starving. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about Marcus, about the promises he'd made before winter set in, about how he'd sworn he'd come back for her before the first snow. The wedding ring on her finger felt heavy as lead, a mockery of vows spoken to a man who'd vanished like morning mist. One of the foals, a paint colt with uneven patches of brown and white, struggled to stand and took a few wobbly steps toward her. His ribs showed plainly through his dull coat. Elena had given him the last of the grain yesterday. "I know, little one," she whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I'm hungry too." Through the grimy window she could see nothing but white. The world had disappeared, swallowed by the endless storm. She tried to leave twice, but the snow was waist-deep and the wind so fierce it had knocked her to her knees before she'd gone 20 yards. A sharp crack echoed through the shack as another board split from the cold. Soon the walls would start failing entirely. Elena pulled her knees to her chest and tried to remember what warmth felt like. That's when she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats cutting through the wind. At first she thought it was her imagination, the cruel trick of a starving mind. But the sound grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Elena struggled to her feet, her legs stiff from cold, and peered through the window. A rider emerged from the white chaos like something out of a fever dream. He sat tall in the saddle despite the storm's fury, his dark coat billowing behind him. His horse, a massive black stallion, moved through the deep snow as if it were nothing more than morning dew. The man's face was hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made Elena's pulse quicken, not with relief, but with an inexplicable sense of unease. He dismounted in one fluid motion and approached the shack. Elena heard his boots on the wooden steps, then a firm knock on the door. "Anyone in there?" His voice was deep and rough, like whiskey over gravel. Elena hesitated, her hand on the door latch. Every instinct screamed that she should be grateful. This man was her salvation, the answer to prayers she'd whispered into the howling wind. But something in his tone made her pause. "Please," she called out, her voice barely audible. "We need help." The door swung open, bringing with it a gust of snow and cold air. The stranger stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the small space. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but couldn't hide the hard line of his mouth. His gaze swept the shack, taking in Elena's hollow cheeks and trembling hands, then settling on the 3 foals in the corner. Something shifted in his expression, not quite softness, but perhaps the absence of hardness. "Yours?" he asked, nodding toward the animals. "I found them," Elena said. "Their mothers were caught in the storm." He moved to examine the foals with practiced hands, checking their legs and listening to their breathing. The paint colt tried to shy away, but the stranger's touch was surprisingly gentle. "They're in bad shape," he said without looking at her. "Another day or two and they'd be gone. Can you help them?" He straightened slowly, his eyes finding hers across the dim space. "I can. Question is what you're willing to do to save them." There was something in his voice that made Elena's skin prickle. "What do you mean?" The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing in this world comes free, miss, especially not rescue." Outside, the wind shrieked like a living thing, and Elena realized she might have just traded one kind of danger for another. The storm showed no mercy through the night. Sarah huddled against the cave wall, listening to the wind howl like something alive and hungry outside their shelter. The three foals pressed close to their mothers, their breath visible in small puffs that disappeared quickly into the frigid air. Despite the fire crackling nearby, the cold seemed to seep through stone and bone alike. Across the flames, the stranger sat with his back against the rock, rifle resting across his knees. Even in sleep, he looked ready to spring into action. Sarah found herself studying his face in the firelight, the strong jaw shadowed with stubble, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the scar that traced a thin line from his left temple to his cheekbone. There was something both dangerous and protective about him, like a wolf guarding sheep. She must have dozed, because suddenly his voice was cutting through her dreams. "Easy there." He was on his feet, moving toward the horses. One of the mares was pawing nervously at the ground, ears pinned back and eyes rolling white. Something's got her spooked. Sarah pushed herself up, her muscles protesting after sleeping on hard stone. Belle's always been skittish in storms, but even as she said it, she noticed the other horses growing restless too. The stranger held up a hand for silence, his head tilted toward the cave entrance. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then Sarah heard it, a low growling that definitely wasn't coming from the storm. "Wolves," he said quietly, checking his rifle. "Pack's probably desperate. This weather's been hard on everything." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The foals were too young, too weak to outrun anything. "How many?" "Hard to say. Could be 3, could be 8. He moved to the entrance, keeping low. "Fire's kept them at bay so far, but they're getting bolder." As if summoned by his words, yellow eyes appeared in the darkness beyond the cave mouth. One pair, then another. Sarah counted at least 4 before losing track. The horses whinnied in terror, the sound echoing off the cave walls. "Get behind the horses," the stranger ordered, raising his rifle. "Keep them as calm as you can." "What's your name?" Sarah asked suddenly. If they were going to die together, she wanted to know who this man was who'd risked everything to help her. He glanced back, surprise flickering across his features. "Jake. Jake Morrison. Thank you, Jake Morrison, for everything." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that careful mask he wore. "Don't thank me yet." The first wolf appeared at the cave entrance, its hackles raised and lips pulled back to reveal ivory fangs. It was massive, grey and black with patches of white, obviously the pack leader. Behind it, shadows moved restlessly. Jake's rifle boomed, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The lead wolf yelped and disappeared, but Sarah didn't know if Jake had hit it or just scared it back. The horses reared and plunged, barely contained within the cave's confines. "That'll give them something to think about," Jake said, but his voice was grim. "Won't keep them back long, though. They can smell the horses, smell fear." Sarah tried to project calm she didn't feel as she moved among the animals, speaking in low, soothing tones. The foals trembled against their mothers, still too young to understand the danger, but sensing it nonetheless. Another pair of eyes appeared, then vanished. The wolves were testing them, looking for weakness. "Why are you out here?" Sarah found herself asking. Facing death had a way of stripping away pretense. I mean, really, men don't usually travel alone in weather like this unless they're running from something. Jake was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the wind. "Sometimes what you're running from is yourself." Before Sarah could respond, 3 wolves appeared at once, their courage bolstered by hunger and desperation. Jake's rifle cracked again, and one of them tumbled backward with a yelp. but the other two kept coming. Sarah grabbed a burning branch from the fire and thrust it toward the nearest wolf. The animal skidded to a halt, snarling, but didn't retreat, its yellow eyes fixed on the smallest foal, calculating distance and opportunity. "Get back!" Jake worked the rifle's action, ejecting the spent cartridge. The metallic sound echoed sharply. "I've got 2 shots left." The wolves seemed to sense their ammunition was limited. They spread out, one moving toward each side of the cave entrance, smart, patient, deadly. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the makeshift torch. The flame flickered dangerously in the wind that swirled through the cave. If it went out, they'd be fighting in darkness. The largest wolf took a step forward, then another, its muscles bunched beneath its thick fur, preparing to spring. Jake's rifle came up smoothly, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. Too many targets, not enough bullets. "When I shoot," he said quietly, "you throw everything you can find at them. Make noise, make yourself big." The wolf's haunches tensed. Time slowed to a crawl. Then everything happened at once. The wind had died to a whisper by dawn, though snow continued to fall in fat, lazy flakes that seemed almost peaceful after the night's fury. Sarah woke to find herself pressed against Cole's chest, his arm draped protectively over her shoulder. For a moment she allowed herself to savor the warmth, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the surprising comfort of human contact after months of solitude. Then reality crashed back. She pulled away abruptly, her cheeks burning despite the cold. "The Foals," she mumbled, scrambling toward the makeshift pen. All 3 were alive, huddled together in the corner. The smallest one, barely larger than a house cat, lifted its head at her approach. Its eyes were clearer now, more alert. Sarah's heart swelled with relief and something dangerously close to hope. They made it through the night. Cole's voice was rough with sleep. He crouched beside her, studying the tiny horses with an expression she couldn't read. "That one's a fighter." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd lost so much already. The farm, her father's dream, any semblance of the life she'd planned. These foals represented everything she had left in the world. "We need to get them warm milk," she said finally, "and proper shelter. This cave won't protect them much longer." Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire he was rebuilding. "There's a place," he said eventually, "about 5 miles east. Old cabin, abandoned for years, but it's sturdy. Has a barn attached. Abandoned by who?" His hands stilled on the kindling. "Does it matter?" There was something in his tone that made her study his profile more carefully. The hard line of his jaw, the way he avoided her eyes. "It matters to me." He stood abruptly, brushing snow from his coat. "We should move while the weather's calm. This is just the eye of the storm." Sarah rose as well, frustration building in her chest. "You can't just keep dodging my questions. I need to know who you are, where you're taking us. These foals are all I have left, and I'm trying to keep them alive." His voice was sharp now, edged with something that might have been pain. "Isn't that enough?" "No, it's not enough." She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the old scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "You appear out of nowhere in the middle of a blizzard. You know exactly where to find shelter, and now you want to take us to some mysterious abandoned cabin. What aren't you telling me?" For a heartbeat, she thought he might answer. His expression softened, and she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath the hardened exterior. Then the walls slammed back up. "Get your things," he said curtly. "We leave in 10 minutes." The journey to the cabin was treacherous. Cole had fashioned a crude sled from pine branches, and they took turns pulling it while the other carried the smallest foal. The snow was knee-deep in places, and Sarah's legs burned with the effort of breaking trail. But Cole had been right about the weather. The wind was picking up again, and the peaceful snowfall was turning back into stinging pellets of ice. When the cabin finally came into view, Sarah's breath caught. It was larger than she'd expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and, as promised, a small barn attached to one side. but it wasn't truly abandoned. Someone had been maintaining it. The roof was intact, the windows unbroken, and there was even a neat stack of firewood by the door. "You've been here before," she said. It wasn't a question. Cole didn't answer, but his shoulders tensed as he approached the door. He hesitated with his hand on the latch, as if steeling himself for something. Then he pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by rough-hewn furniture that looked handmade. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and simple pottery. Everything was clean, dusted, as if someone had just stepped out for a walk. "Cole." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Whose cabin is this?" He was standing in the center of the room, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the windows. When he finally looked at her, she saw something broken in his expression. "Mine," he said quietly. "It was mine." The admission hung between them like a physical thing. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, rearranging themselves into a picture she wasn't sure she wanted to see. The careful way he'd avoided towns, the haunted look in his eyes, the fact that he'd been riding alone in a blizzard with nothing but the clothes on his back. "What happened here?" she asked. Cole turned away, moving toward the fireplace with mechanical precision. "We need to get the foals warm and fed," he said. "The storm's coming back." But Sarah could see it now, in the careful arrangement of the furniture, in the way his hands shook as he built the fire. This wasn't just his cabin. This had been his home. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the pale morning sun. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching Elijah move between the makeshift shelter and the main structure, his movements efficient despite the obvious stiffness in his left shoulder. She'd noticed him favoring it more since yesterday's exertions, though he'd said nothing. The foals were stronger now, their legs steadier as they nursed. Bella had recovered her maternal instincts with fierce determination, nuzzling each of her babies with the devotion Sarah had hoped for but hadn't dared expect. The sight filled her with a bittersweet mixture of relief and growing dread. Soon, very soon, she would have no excuse to remain here. "Coffee's ready," she called as Elijah stamped the snow from his boots at the threshold. He nodded his thanks, accepting the steaming mug with hands that were red from cold despite his gloves. Temperatures rising, snow's already starting to soften on the south-facing slopes. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. How long before the trail down is passable? Day, maybe 2 if we get more snow tonight. His grey eyes studied her face over the rim of his mug. "Your husband will be looking for you." The lie sat between them like a stone in still water. She'd maintained the fiction of her marriage these past days, though she suspected he saw through it. Men like Elijah, men who lived on the edges of civilization, developed instincts about deception. They had to survive. "Thomas worries," she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue now. She'd spoken it so rarely since fleeing Denver that it almost belonged to someone else's life. "Worries enough to follow you into a blizzard with 3 newborn foals?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah set down her mug with careful precision, watching the dark liquid tremble slightly. "You don't understand the situation. Then help me understand." She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. There was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet patience that somehow made her want to tell him everything. About Thomas Whitmore's heavy hands and heavier debts, about the way he'd looked at Bella and spoken of selling her to pay what he owed, about the cold calculation in his eyes when he'd discovered her father's will had left the mare solely to her. Instead, she said, "Some situations don't have good solutions." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, rolling the mug between his palms. "I knew a man once," he said finally, "who thought the same thing, believed he was trapped by circumstances beyond his control, convinced himself that doing terrible things was the only way out. What happened to him? He died badly, and took innocent people with him." The weight in his voice told her he wasn't speaking of some distant acquaintance. Sarah felt something shift in the space between them, as if he'd opened a door she hadn't known existed. Was he a friend? He was me. The admission fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. Sarah felt her breath catch, not from fear, but from the raw honesty of it. She'd suspected darkness in his past. No man lived this isolated, this carefully hidden without reason. But hearing him speak it aloud was different. "And now?" she asked. "Now I know that sometimes the price of staying alive isn't worth paying." Through the window, she could see one of the foals taking tentative steps in the snow, his legs finding strength with each movement. New life, finding its way despite the cold and uncertainty. Like her, perhaps, if she could find the courage. "The mare," she said slowly. "She's mine. My father left her to me before he died, but my Thomas sees her differently, sees her value in dollars rather than—" she gestured helplessly, "rather than heart. Yes." Elijah set down his mug and moved to stand beside her at the window. His presence was warm and solid, a bulwark against uncertainties she couldn't yet name. "You could stay," he said quietly. "Winter will close the high passes soon. No one could reach this place until spring." The offer hung between them, full of possibility and peril. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. Stay here, in this rough cabin with this complicated man? Abandon the life she'd known, the expectations that had shaped her, for something unknown? "I couldn't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." She turned to face him fully, searching his weathered features for signs of what such an offer might mean. What she saw there made her breath catch, not pity or mere kindness, but something deeper, something that recognized her not as a woman to be rescued, but as an equal worth standing beside. Outside, the foals grew stronger with each passing hour, preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. Perhaps, Sarah thought, she could do the same. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the morning sun. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching steam rise from the horses' nostrils as they moved through the snow-covered meadow. The foals had grown stronger overnight, their legs steadier beneath them as they explored their new world. Behind her, Cole moved quietly around the cabin, gathering his few belongings. The sound of leather against wood, the soft clink of metal, each noise reminded her that this sanctuary was temporary, that he was temporary. "They're beautiful," she said, not turning from the window. "The foals. I never imagined they'd be so resilient." "Horses are survivors," Cole replied, his voice closer than she'd expected. "They know how to endure what seems impossible." She finally faced him, noting the way he avoided her gaze. His jaw was set in that familiar line of determination, but something had shifted since yesterday. The walls he'd built around himself seemed higher, more impenetrable. "When will you leave?" The question hung between them like smoke. Cole's hands stilled on the leather satchel he'd been packing. "Soon. The weather's clear enough now." "That's not what I asked." He looked up then, and she saw something raw in his dark eyes before he shuttered it away. "After I check the trail down the mountain. Make sure it's safe for you and the horses." Sarah stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What if I don't want you to go, Sarah?" Her name was a warning, spoken low and rough. "What if I asked you to stay?" Cole set down the satchel and turned to face her fully. The space between them felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know enough." She reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. "I know you're a good man, despite whatever you think you've done. I know you saved my life, saved theirs. I know that for the first time in years, I don't feel alone." His hand caught hers, his grip gentle but firm. "And I know that Thomas Hartwell has men looking for me, men who won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way." The name hit her like a physical blow. Thomas Hartwell owned half the territory, his influence reaching into every town, every ranch, every life worth controlling. She'd heard whispers of his ruthlessness, the way people who crossed him simply disappeared. "What did you do to him?" Cole's laugh held no humor. "I cost him something he valued more than money. He released her hand, stepping back. His reputation. Through the window, one of the foals whinnied, the sound high and clear in the morning air. Cole's expression softened as he watched the small creature leap through the snow, its mother close behind. "I worked for him once," he continued, his voice distant. "Did things I'm not proud of. But there was a family, homesteaders who wouldn't sell their land. Hartwell wanted it for a railroad deal." He paused, his jaw working. "He sent me to convince them." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "And did you?" "I tried. But the man had a daughter, maybe 16. Sweet girl who reminded me of my sister." Cole's hands clenched into fists. When talking didn't work, Hartwell sent others, told them to make it convincing. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken horrors. "I got there in time to stop the worst of it, but the damage was done. The father was hurt bad, the girl terrorized." Cole's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I helped them pack what they could carry and got them to safety, but Hartwell's men saw me leaving. So you've been running ever since. 3 years now." He picked up his satchel again, the movement sharp and decisive. "And I won't stop running because of—" "Because of what?" Sarah interrupted, stepping closer. "Because you might find something worth staying for?" Cole's eyes met hers, and she saw the war raging behind them, desire battling duty, hope fighting despair. For a moment she thought he might reach for her, might choose the possibility of something good over the certainty of loneliness. Instead, he shouldered his pack and walked toward the door. "I'll be back before sunset," he said without turning around, "to make sure you can get down the mountain safely." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sarah alone with the crackling fire and the weight of unspoken words. Through the window she watched him mount his horse and ride toward the tree line, his figure growing smaller against the vast white landscape. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the cold seep through. Outside, the foals played in the snow, unaware that their world was about to change again. Just like hers had, the moment a stranger with haunted eyes had appeared in the storm. The question now was whether she'd let him disappear just as quietly. The blizzard had settled into a relentless rhythm, but inside the cabin, warmth flickered between them like the flames in the hearth. Sarah watched Jack move with practiced efficiency as he checked on the foals, his calloused hands gentle against their trembling flanks. Each tender gesture contradicted the hardness she glimpsed in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. "They're stronger today," she said, settling beside him on the rough wooden floor. The smallest foal, the one she'd begun calling Hope, nuzzled against her palm with increasing vigor. Jack nodded, but his attention seemed elsewhere. He'd been distant since their conversation the night before, when she'd pressed him about his past. The walls he'd allowed to crumble had rebuilt themselves overnight, leaving her feeling more isolated than she had during those first terrifying hours alone in the storm. "There's something you need to know," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the wind's howl. "About why I'm really here." Sarah's stomach tightened. She'd sensed secrets lurking beneath his careful kindness, but now that the moment of revelation had arrived, she wasn't sure she wanted to hear them. "I wasn't just passing through when I found you," Jack continued, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I've been tracking someone, following a trail that led me into these mountains." "Who?" The word escaped before she could stop it. Jack's jaw worked silently for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old wounds. "My brother, former brother, I should say. He took something from me that I can never get back." Sarah waited, sensing that pushing would only drive him further into silence. Outside, the wind screamed against the cabin walls, but inside, the quiet stretched taut between them. "We used to work together," Jack said at last. "Ran a small ranch down in Colorado, built it from nothing with our own hands. Then he met a woman, married her despite my warnings. She had expensive tastes and big city dreams, started filling his head with ideas about easy money. The smallest foal whickered softly, and Sarah stroked its neck, keeping her attention carefully divided between the animal and Jack's story. "Bank robbery," he said simply. "That's how it started. Just one job, they said, enough to pay off debts and start fresh somewhere else. But I knew better. I'd seen what that kind of life did to men, how it hollowed them out from the inside. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. You tried to stop him. I tried everything, reasoning, pleading, even offered to buy out his half of the ranch. But she had her hooks in deep, and he was lost to me long before they ever drew their first gun. Jack's hands stilled on the foal he'd been examining. They killed a guard during their third job, shot him down in cold blood while he was begging for his life. The revelation hung between them like smoke. Sarah found herself studying Jack's profile, searching for signs of deception or violence, but saw only grief etched in the lines around his eyes. The law came for all of us, he continued. Guilt by association, they called it. I spent 2 years in territorial prison before I could prove I'd had nothing to do with their crimes. 2 years while my brother and his wife disappeared into the wilderness with blood money in their pockets. Understanding dawned slowly. You've been hunting them. For 3 years now, following reports, tracking leads, always one step behind. He finally looked at her, and she saw something dangerous flickering in his expression. Until last week, I found their camp about 10 miles north of here. They've been wintering in an old trapper's cabin, living off stolen gold while good men rot in graves. Sarah's mouth went dry. They're that close? Close enough. Jack stood abruptly, moving to the window where he peered through a gap in the boards they'd used to reinforce it against the storm. This blizzard's been a blessing and a curse. Trapped them same as us, but also given them time to fortify their position. What are you going to do? The question seemed to surprise him. He turned back to her, and for a moment, his careful mask slipped completely. She saw the boy he must have been before betrayal and loss had carved him into something harder. I don't know, he admitted. For 3 years I've known exactly what I'd do when I found them. But now... His gaze moved to her, then to the foals, before returning to her face. Now everything's different. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that glittered under the pale morning sun. Sarah stood at the window of the cabin, watching Elijah work with the foals in the makeshift pen he'd constructed from salvaged timber. 3 days had passed since their rescue, and already the young horses showed remarkable improvement under his careful ministrations. Luna, the smallest of the 3, had taken particular interest in Elijah. The black filly followed him everywhere, her tiny hooves clicking against the packed snow as she trotted behind him like a devoted shadow. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she watched the hardened man speak softly to the animal, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about him. "You're getting attached," she murmured to herself, though whether she meant Elijah's growing bond with the horses or her own feelings toward the mysterious stranger, she couldn't say. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention toward the ridge. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses picking their way carefully down the snowy slope. Sarah's stomach clenched as she recognized the lead rider's distinctive silver-trimmed saddle and the cruel set of his shoulders. Marcus Blackwood had found them. She rushed outside, her boots slipping on the icy ground. "Elijah!" she called, her voice tight with fear. He looked up from where he knelt beside one of the foals, his eyes immediately finding the approaching riders. Something shifted in his expression, a hardness settling over his features like a mask. When he stood, Sarah noticed his hand instinctively move toward the gun at his hip. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Take the foals into the back room." "No." Sarah moved to stand beside him. "This is my fight. Marcus is here because of me." The riders drew closer, and Sarah could see Marcus's face clearly now. His usual smug expression was replaced by something darker, more dangerous. The 2 men flanking him were strangers, but the guns at their sides and the cold calculation in their eyes marked them as hired muscle. Marcus brought his horse to a stop 20 feet away, his gaze moving between Sarah and Elijah with obvious displeasure. "Well, well. Seems my runaway bride has found herself a protector." "I'm not your bride," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I never will be." Marcus's laugh was sharp and humorless. That's where you're wrong, darling. Your father's debts don't disappear just because you run off into the wilderness. In fact, they've grown considerably with interest. Elijah stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah. The ladies made her position clear. I suggest you respect it. And I suggest you mind your own business, stranger. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he studied Elijah more closely. Something flickered across his face, recognition perhaps, or suspicion. Though there's something familiar about you. Have we met? Sarah felt Elijah tense beside her, saw the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. I don't believe we have. Marcus continued to stare, his head tilted slightly. You remind me of someone. A man I knew back in Texas. Caused quite a stir when he disappeared from Huntsville. The Rangers were very interested in finding him. The words hung in the cold air like a threat. Sarah's heart pounded as she glanced at Elijah, seeing the careful control he maintained over his expression. Whatever secrets he carried, Marcus was dancing dangerously close to them. Lots of men drift through Texas, Elijah said evenly. Easy to confuse faces. Perhaps. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, no matter. I'm here for what belongs to me, nothing more. His gaze shifted back to Sarah. Come along, dear. We have a wedding to plan. She's not going anywhere. The quiet authority in Elijah's voice made even Marcus's hired guns shift nervously in their saddles. Sarah had heard that tone before, in the cabin during the worst of the storm, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Is that so? Marcus's hand moved toward his gun. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? The tension stretched taut between them, like a rope about to snap. Sarah could feel the violence coiled in the air, waiting for the smallest provocation to explode into action. She thought of the foals behind them, innocent creatures caught in a web of human greed and desperation. There's another way, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the standoff. Both men looked at her, and she took a shaky breath. A wager. You always did love your gambling, Marcus. Interest flickered in the banker's eyes. What kind of wager? Sarah's mind raced, searching for something that might appeal to his arrogance while buying them time. A horse race. Your best mount against mine. Winner takes all. Either I go with you willingly or you forgive my father's debts and leave us alone forever. Marcus considered this, his gaze moving to the foals in the pen. Those babies can barely walk, let alone race. Not them, Sarah said, her heart hammering. Luna, the black filly, give me 1 month to train her and we'll race. The morning brought an uneasy quiet that settled over the cabin like a held breath. Sarah woke to find Jack's bedroll empty, the door slightly ajar despite the cold. Through the gap she could see him standing motionless in the snow, his rifle cradled in his arms as he scanned the tree line with the focused intensity of a man who'd learned to read danger in shadows. She pulled her coat tight and stepped outside, her boots crunching in the fresh powder that had fallen during the night. The foals were stirring in their makeshift shelter, and she could hear their soft nickering as they searched for their mother's warmth. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Jack didn't turn, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. Tracks. Leading up from the valley. He pointed toward a line of disturbed snow that wound between the pines. 3 horses, maybe 4. They stopped about a quarter-mile down, like they were watching. Sarah's blood chilled, and it had nothing to do with the mountain air. Could be travelers, lost like we were. Could be. The doubt in his voice was unmistakable. But travelers don't usually scout a place before approaching, and they don't usually turn back when they find what they're looking for. The implications hung between them like smoke. Sarah found herself studying Jack's profile, noting the hard set of his jaw, the way his eyes never stopped moving. Whatever he was running from, it had found him even here, in this remote wilderness that felt like the edge of the world. "We should leave," she said quietly. "The foals aren't strong enough yet. Another day, maybe 2. He finally looked at her, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Regret. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for this to follow me to you." Before she could respond, a sound drifted up from the valley below. It was faint but unmistakable, the whinny of a horse answered by another. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. "Get inside," he said. "Keep the foals quiet." Sarah wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the urgency in his voice sent her moving toward the cabin. She paused at the door, looking back at him standing alone against the vast white landscape, and felt something twist in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Inside, she gathered the foals close, stroking their necks to keep them calm. Through the window, she watched Jack disappear into the trees, moving with a silence that spoke of hard-earned experience. The minutes stretched like hours, marked only by the soft breathing of the young horses and the occasional crack of settling timber. When Jack returned, his face was grim. "They're gone. For now." He set his rifle aside and began gathering supplies with methodical efficiency. "But they'll be back, probably waiting for dark. Who are they?" The question came out sharper than Sarah intended. Jack's hands stilled on the pack he was filling. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the cabin's gaps. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds. "I used to ride with a man named Cole Brennan. This was years ago, before I knew what he really was." He continued packing, not meeting her eyes. "By the time I realized he was more outlaw than cowboy, I was in too deep. When I finally tried to leave, I took something that belonged to him." "What?" "Evidence. Documents that could put him and half his crew in front of a hanging judge." Jack's laugh held no humor. "I thought I could trade it for my freedom. Instead, I made myself a marked man." Sarah processed this, trying to reconcile the gentle man who'd saved her foals with the picture he was painting. "And now he's found you." "Looks that way." Jack finished with the pack and turned to face her fully. "I won't ask you to trust me, Sarah. I know what this looks like. But I need you to know, everything I told you about wanting to start over, about finding something worth protecting, that wasn't a lie." "The foals," she said. "Can we move them?" "If we have to." "But it's risky." Sarah nodded, understanding the impossible choice they faced. Stay and fight men who would show no mercy, or flee into the wilderness with 3 fragile lives depending on their survival. Outside, the wind picked up, setting the pine boughs to singing their ancient song. Somewhere in that sound was the promise of another storm, another test of their resolve. But there was also something else, a defiance that matched the steel growing in Sarah's spine. She'd already lost too much to let fear take what remained. "Then we make our stand here," she said. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by silence and snow. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching Jacob harness the horses with practiced efficiency. 3 days of forced intimacy had changed something fundamental between them, though neither had spoken of it directly. The foals were strong enough to travel now, their legs steady beneath them as they nursed and played in the makeshift stall Jacob had built. "The pass should be clear by afternoon," Jacob said, not looking at her as he checked the leather straps. His voice carried the same careful distance he'd maintained since their kiss by the fire. "We can reach town before nightfall if we leave within the hour." Sarah nodded, though her chest tightened with each word. Town meant safety, meant veterinary care for the foals, meant returning to her life. It also meant saying goodbye to the man who had saved not just her horses, but something in herself she hadn't realized was lost. "Jacob." She stepped outside, the cold air sharp against her face. "There's something I need to tell you before we go." He paused in his work, his hands stilling on the harness. The morning light caught the planes of his face, highlighting the scar that ran along his jaw, a mark she'd traced with her fingertips in the darkness of their shared warmth. "The ranch," she continued, her breath forming clouds between them. "I'm not just trying to save it for myself. My father built it from nothing, but before he died, he borrowed against it. The banknote comes due in 6 weeks. If I can't make the payment—" She swallowed hard. "These foals were supposed to be my salvation. Their bloodline is worth enough to save everything." Jacob's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps. or recognition of a familiar desperation. How much do you owe? His question was quiet, matter-of-fact. $3,000. The number hung between them like a physical thing. It might as well be 3 million. He turned back to the horses, his movements deliberate. There are other ways to raise money. Not in 6 weeks. Not without selling the land itself, which defeats the purpose. She moved closer, close enough to smell the leather and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. I'm not telling you this because I expect anything. After everything we've shared, you deserve to know what's at stake. Jacob finished with the harness and faced her fully. The distance in his eyes had been replaced by something she couldn't quite read. What if there was another way? What do you mean? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing it. The man I was before, the one I told you about, I wasn't just any outlaw, Sarah. I rode with the Brennan gang for 5 years. We hit banks, trains, mining operations. I know where money is hidden, money that's been sitting untouched because the men who stole it are all dead or in prison. Sarah's heart began to pound. Jacob, no, whatever you're thinking. Not stealing, he said quickly. There's a cache hidden in the Badlands about 2 days' ride south. Money from a train robbery in Colorado, money that was never recovered because Brennan got himself killed before he could retrieve it. No one's looking for it anymore. No one even knows it exists except me. The weight of his words settled over her like a physical thing. That's still stolen money. From a railroad company that cheats ranchers and farmers out of their land every day. His voice carried a bitter edge. Money that's doing no good, buried in a cave while good people lose everything they've worked for. Sarah stared at him, torn between hope and horror. The practical part of her mind was already calculating. $3,000 would save the ranch, would secure her future, would honor her father's legacy. But accepting such money would make her complicit in crimes she'd never committed, would bind her to Jacob's dark past in ways she wasn't sure she could live with. Why would you do this for me? She whispered. Jacob stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. Because in 3 days you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, hope that I might be worth saving, that I might deserve a different kind of life. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with infinite gentleness. But I won't ask you to choose that life with me. I know what I am, what I've done. You deserve better than a man with blood on his hands and a price on his head. Sarah leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The choice before her was impossible. Accept his help and compromise everything she believed about right and wrong, or refuse and lose everything her father had built. But looking into Jacob's face, she realized the choice wasn't really about money at all. It was about whether she was brave enough to believe that people could change, that love could be worth the risk of losing everything. The foals nickered softly from their stall, innocent and trusting, depending on her to make the right choice. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the pale morning sun. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching steam rise from the horses' nostrils as they grazed on the hay Jack had scattered in the makeshift paddock. 3 weeks had passed since the blizzard trapped them together, and the foals had grown stronger each day, their legs more steady, their coats thicker against the mountain cold. But something had changed in Jack over the past few days. He'd grown distant again, spending long hours outside repairing fences that didn't need fixing, chopping wood they didn't need for burning. When he thought she wasn't looking, she'd catch him staring toward the valley with an expression she couldn't read, part longing, part resignation. The pass should be clear by tomorrow, he said without turning from where he stood by the door, pulling on his worn leather gloves. Weather's been holding steady. Sarah's heart clenched. They'd both known this moment would come, but she'd pushed it from her mind, focusing instead on the warmth of his laugh when the foals played, the gentle way his hands moved when he helped her with their care, the quiet conversations by firelight that had revealed pieces of the man beneath his guarded exterior. I see. She kept her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she poured coffee into 2 tin cups. I suppose I should start preparing for the journey down. Jack finally turned, his dark eyes searching her face. Sarah, There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said before. She'd been dreading this conversation, sensing it building like another storm on the horizon. The past you mentioned, the reason you came up here. He nodded, accepting the coffee cup but not drinking. 3 years ago, I was a different man. Had a ranch down in Colorado, a woman I planned to marry, a future all mapped out. His jaw tightened. I also had a partner in a cattle venture, man named Harrison Webb. Sarah's blood chilled at the name. She knew it, had heard it whispered in the towns where decent folks feared to speak too loudly of certain men. Webb was into things I didn't know about at first. Rustling mostly, but worse too. When I found out, I tried to get clear of him, tried to take what was mine and walk away. Jack's voice grew rough. He didn't see it that way. Burned out my ranch, killed my livestock, shot my foreman when he tried to stop them. Dear God. Sarah reached for his arm, but he stepped back. That's not the worst of it. His eyes met hers, and she saw the pain he'd been carrying. Webb took my woman, Emma, as leverage. Said if I ever came after him, if I ever testified against him, he'd kill her. So I ran, came up here and left her with that monster. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Sarah felt the weight of his confession settling between them like a physical thing. Is she still, she began, alive? I don't know. I tell myself she found a way to escape, that she's somewhere safe, but I haven't had word in 3 years. He set down his cup with shaking hands. I'm a coward, Sarah. I saved myself and left her to face whatever Webb had planned. Sarah studied his face, seeing not cowardice, but a man torn apart by an impossible choice. You couldn't have known what would happen if you'd stayed and fought. You might have gotten her killed, or I might have saved her. The bitterness in his voice cut through her. Instead, I've been hiding up here like some hermit while she suffers for my failures. What I should have done 3 years ago, go back. Find her if she's still alive, make Webb pay for what he's done. He looked at her, then with such intensity it took her breath away. But first I need to get you and the foals safely down the mountain. Jack, you don't have to. Yes, I do. He crossed to her then, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. These weeks with you, watching you fight for those foals, seeing your strength, it's reminded me what courage really looks like. You never gave up, never stopped fighting, even when everything seemed hopeless. Come with me, he whispered, his forehead touching hers. I know it's asking too much, but I can't bear the thought of losing you too. The request hung between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her own choice settling on her shoulders like winter itself. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the pale morning sun. Elena stood at the cabin window, watching Caleb work with the foals in the makeshift corral he'd built from fallen timber. 2 weeks had transformed everything. The horses were stronger, the danger had passed, and yet her heart felt more fragile than ever. She traced frost patterns on the glass, knowing their time here was ending. The radio had crackled to life yesterday with news that the mountain roads were finally clear. Soon she'd have to return to her ranch, to the debts waiting like vultures, to a life that felt increasingly hollow. You're thinking too loud again. Elena turned to find Caleb filling the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his dark eyes unreadable. He'd been pulling away these past few days, preparing for goodbye in the way wounded animals prepared for winter, by building walls. The roads are clear, she said, hating how the words tasted like goodbye. I heard. He moved to the fireplace, adding wood with methodical precision. Your horses are strong enough to travel now. The space between them felt vast, despite the cabin's small confines. Elena crossed to him, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands lingered on simple tasks to avoid looking at her. Come with me, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before courage could abandon her. His hands stilled. Elena, I know what you're going to say, that your past makes it impossible, that you're not the settling kind, that I deserve better. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. But what if I disagree? What if I think you're exactly what I need? Caleb straightened slowly, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. You don't know what you're saying. The men looking for me will eventually stop looking. People forget, Caleb. They move on. But this, she gestured between them, this doesn't come along every day. I should know. I spent 5 years in a marriage where I felt like a ghost. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor he'd been building. You think it's that simple? I think it's as complicated as we make it. Elena reached for his hands, finding them warm and calloused and steady. I'm not asking for promises about forever. I'm asking you to try, to see if what we found here can survive out there. Caleb pulled away, pacing to the window where the foals played in the snow. I've been running for 3 years, Elena. It's who I am now. No, it's what you do. There's a difference. She followed him, refusing to let him retreat. The man who saved my horses, who built them shelter with his bare hands, who held me through nightmares. That's who you are. The running is just fear wearing a different coat. He spun to face her, eyes flashing. Fear? You think I'm afraid? I think you're terrified, she said quietly. Not of those men chasing you, but of wanting something enough to fight for it, of letting someone matter. The words hung between them like a challenge. Outside, one of the foals whinnied, a sound full of joy and life and promise. Caleb's shoulders sagged slightly. What if I bring danger to your door? What if you bring love to it instead? The question seemed to physically impact him. He sat heavily in the wooden chair by the fire, running his hands through his hair. Elena knelt beside him, resting her palms on his knees. I lost my ranch once, she said softly. When my husband died, I thought I'd lost everything. But sitting here, watching you with the horses, seeing how you fix things instead of breaking them, I realized I was wrong. The ranch isn't what I was afraid to lose. It was hope, purpose, the feeling that tomorrow might be better than today. Caleb's hands covered hers, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. You give me too much credit. You don't give yourself enough. Elena leaned forward. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be present, to stop running long enough to see if we can build something worth staying for. For a long moment, only the fire's crackling filled the silence. Then Caleb lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a prayer. If I come with you, he said slowly, everything changes. No more hiding, no more moving when things get complicated. Everything's already changed, Elena whispered. The moment you chose to save us instead of riding past. Caleb stood, pulling her with him, his arms encircling her waist. You realize you're asking a drifter to learn how to stay. I'm asking a good man to remember that he's worth loving. When he kissed her this time, it tasted like yes, like hope, like the promise of spring after the longest winter either of them had known. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows with a clarity that hadn't existed in days. Elena stood at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching Jake through the glass as he worked with the foals in the makeshift corral he'd built. The storm had finally broken completely, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine snow and crystalline air. She studied his movements, patient, methodical, gentle. The same hands that had delivered 3 miracles in a blizzard now guided the gangly creatures through their first real steps in the sunshine. Dancer, the smallest of the 3, had already claimed Jake as her favorite, following him around the enclosure like a devoted puppy. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the horizon. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their mounts picking careful paths through the snow drifts. Elena's stomach clenched as she recognized the lead figure, Sheriff Morrison, his badge catching the morning sun like a warning. Jake had seen them too. She watched him straighten, his entire demeanor shifting from relaxed to alert in the span of a heartbeat. He spoke quietly to the foals, then walked toward the cabin with measured steps. Elena. His voice was steady when he entered, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. We need to talk before they get here. She set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. How long have you known they were coming? I've been expecting them for days. He moved to the window, watching the riders approach. The storm bought us time, but it was always going to end. What did you do, Jake? Really? He was quiet for a long moment, his breath fogging the glass. I killed a man in Denver 3 months ago. The words hung between them like a physical thing. Elena felt the floor shift beneath her feet, though she remained perfectly still. He was hurting a woman, Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper, beating her in an alley behind the Silver Dollar. I tried to stop him, tried to pull him off her, but he came at me with a knife, and I... He turned to face her, his eyes haunted. I didn't mean to kill him, but he hit his head when he fell. The woman disappeared before the law arrived, left me standing over a dead man with no witnesses to tell the truth of it. His laugh was bitter. Turned out he was the son of a territorial judge. Suddenly, stopping a beating became murder in the first degree. Elena's mind raced, processing everything. His careful way of avoiding towns, the wariness she'd sometimes caught in his expression, the gentle reverence with which he treated her, and everything fragile. So you ran. I ran. He moved away from the window as the sound of hooves grew closer. And now I brought this to your door. The knock came firm and official. Jake moved to answer it, but Elena stepped forward first. This is my ranch, she said quietly. My door. Sheriff Morrison stood flanked by 2 deputies, all 3 men snow-dusted and trail-weary. Morrison touched his hat brim in greeting. Morning, Mrs. Chen. I believe you have a guest we need to speak with. Sheriff. Elena's voice was steady, surprising herself. What brings you out here so early? Jake Sullivan, one of the deputies, spoke up, impatient. We know he's here. Jake appeared in the doorway behind Elena, his hands visible and empty. I'm here. Morrison's hand rested casually on his gun butt. Jake Sullivan, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Whitmore in Denver. You'll need to come with us. I understand. Jake stepped forward, but Elena moved to block his path. Wait! Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained clear. Sheriff, this man saved my life and the lives of 3 foals during the blizzard. He's shown nothing but honor and kindness. Ma'am, I'm sure that's true, but he's also asked me to marry him. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. And I've accepted. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. Morrison frowned, clearly calculating the complications this development presented. That doesn't change what he's accused of, Mrs. Chen. No, Elena agreed, stepping closer to Jake, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. But it changes everything else. She turned to face Jake fully, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on still water. I meant what I said, if you'll have me knowing what this means. Jake's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. Elena, you can't. I can, she said simply. And I will. Morrison cleared his throat. This is all very touching, but I still have a job to do. Elena squeezed Jake's hand, drawing strength from the connection. Then do it, Sheriff, but know that he won't be facing whatever comes alone.